This podcast episode may contain language and depiction of suicide and eating disorders that some survivors or those in recovery may find upsetting. Please consider your triggers and well-being before listening to this episode. Hi, I'm Carra, and I'm here to change the conversations around mental health and eating disorders, bringing real-life stories of survivors, those in recovery, and my personal journey. It is estimated that 1 in 5 adults experience mental health illness. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 34. It is estimated that 8 million Americans have an eating disorder, 7 million women and 1 million men. Only 1 in 10 people with an eating disorder actually receive treatment. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. 1 person dies as a direct result of their eating disorder every 52 minutes, whether through medical complications or by suicide. This podcast will lead the way for having those hard conversations about mental health and eating disorders. This podcast will also focus on the healing properties of being in nature, which for me, completely changed my life. I hit my breaking point and I needed help. On June 16th, 2021, I had a plan to take my life. In today's episode of the Journey Podcast, we'll be talking about the raw view of the day that I was admitted to the Behavioral Health Center. Have you ever hit your breaking point? The point where nothing in life seems to matter? You can see all the warning signs, but you just don't care anymore. You have reached the point that you don't want to live anymore. In today's episode, we'll continue exploring my journey. For those of you that don't know, I've been working in the veterinary field for over 17 years. I'm a registered veterinary technician and have worked in many different roles throughout the veterinary field. The veterinary field has been a massive part of my life. I've had struggles in this field, but I think that everybody can say that the pandemic changed just about every field, but it definitely changed the veterinary field, and it kind of made me hit my all-time low. 5 years is the average amount of time a veterinary technician actually stays in the veterinary field. 5 years. I took a continuing education course about how veterinary professionals are more likely to join this field already being diagnosed with a mental illness. In a field full of puppies and kittens, yes, but also a field full of sadness, trauma, neglect, abuse, and more, this topic needs to be discussed more in veterinary professional schools, hospitals, and clinics. Every hospital and school should have an on-site social worker or have access to one. I will deep dive into this in a later episode, but a lot of times medical benefits or free health care often do not cover mental health care. Mental health is health, but sometimes it's just not covered. It should be a top priority in the veterinary field and this entire country. Anyways, I will get off my soapbox. So why are we talking about this? Because I have a very important and special guest with me today. She is a social worker at the company that I used to work for and one of the people who was instrumental in saving my life on June 16, 2021. Rebecca is not only an LCSW, she is also a veterinary social worker. I helped hire Rebecca to start the veterinary social worker program at the animal hospital I used to work for, as mental health and the well-being of the staff was always a top priority to me. Rebecca has been given my complete consent to discuss my treatment and my sessions working with her at my previous job. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited you're here. Before we get into that day, could you explain what an LCSW is and what you've done in this field thus far?
Yes. So LCSW stands for Licensed Clinical Social Worker. I'm in the state of California. We're in the state of California. Every state has a little bit different of an acronym, but essentially an LCSW is someone who has firstly completed their MSW program, which is a 2 years mental health master's program, essentially. Post MSW, you get your associate license and you're working under an LCSW who provides clinical supervision. To then graduate to the next steps of that, you have to have 3,000 working hours under that LCSW, 104 weeks of clinical supervision. You have to take your law and ethics exam, take a bunch of CE courses throughout that time that you're working towards licensure. You submit everything to the Board of Behavioral Sciences, and then you get approved to take your clinical exam. Once you pass your clinical exam, then you're independently working as a licensed clinical social worker.
That's crazy. That's crazy. That's so much.
It took a long time.
Yes, it sounds like it. And what were you doing previous to veterinary work?
Yes. So in your master's program, you have what's called field placement, which is essentially internship. That's also a course that you're taking. So my second year field placement was at Kaiser. So I basically got hired on immediately after graduating at my second year field placement, which was Kaiser, the tertiary Kaiser Los Angeles Medical Center. So I was a human medical social worker. I was working in neurology at the time.
And then can you explain what a VSW is?
Yes. So a VSW is a veterinary social worker. It's been around for quite some time, almost 30 years, I think, but it's still not really common. Most people don't know about it. I didn't know about it before I was in my position. The schools don't really know about it, so it's not really taught, but it's definitely becoming more commonplace. So in my opinion, a veterinary social worker is a type of medical social worker that is placed at an animal hospital. So the role can be multifaceted, but to not go on for a really long time, the short of it is a veterinary social worker provides clinical support services to the owners of the patients in the hospital as well as the staff in the hospital.
So what made you want to make the move over to the veterinary field?
I had zero desire to leave my job, my previous job. I loved my job. I was working with a lot of neurodegenerative patients, and I was very passionate, specifically with the ALS community that I was working with. And I love them, miss them. I wasn't looking to leave, and I just happened to be walking down a hallway, and someone basically just mentioned that they had applied for a veterinary social work position, and I stopped in my tracks. I was like, what is that? I've never heard of that before. And I had just gotten my LCSW like a few months prior. And I had also recently lost my dog, my family dog. It was the first time I experienced that type of pet loss. I had always been an animal person my whole life. I love animals and I love people. And I didn't really know that there was a job where I could combine both of those things. So I asked this person if they felt comfortable with me just submitting my resume. I didn't even do a cover letter or anything. I was very passive about the application process because I was like, I don't know, I don't really want to leave my job, but I might as well just submit my resume since I have my LCSW. And then as soon as I had my first interview, I was like, oh, I'm going to fight for this. I really want this. I think this is the job that I've been searching for my whole life that I didn't know at the time existed. And yeah, I was like, no, I will be getting this position.
I remember that. I can tell you everybody that I pushed for Rebecca so much when we were fighting for her. So it's just a great transition that happened.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Can you explain more about what you currently do at the veterinary hospital that you work for, like a little bit more in depth of what you do for staff versus owners?
Yeah. So now my title is Social Services Manager. So when I originally started, I was actually the first veterinary social work in Southern California. As of currently, there's still probably under 50 who actually work in animal hospitals in the country. But now I have 2 employees that work under me. So part of my job is managing my employees because it's a 24/7 emergency and specialty hospital. To again, simplify something that I could talk about for a long time, if I could put it in kind of 2 basic sectors, is the client work and the staff work. So client work, a large majority of what I do is in the emergency department, but I do work with clients in every single specialty and emergency. In the emergency, the biggest chunk of the clients that I see are either anticipatory grief or euthanasia cases. So if a patient comes into emergency and there are some quality of life concerns, whether that's acute or it's happened over kind of a prolonged period of time, working with the staff to take a lot of that emotional labor in those conversations away from the technicians and the DAs and the doctors, kind of talking through options with people, providing anticipatory guidance if euthanasia is on the table, reviewing aftercare options. Often I am in there when the euthanasia happens, and then providing grief services thereafter. So I'm never providing therapy necessarily to the clients or the staff, but I call them, it's kind of crisis intervention services. I call them bridge services as well. So I can get you through this period of crisis or big life transition and provide a warm handoff for kind of the next steps if long-term therapy is something that's needed. They're also, encompassed in that is like any sort of de-escalation. People are often very scared or angry or sad when they come into the hospital, because if they come into the hospital, whether that's, nutrition to emergency, that can be a form of crisis to them. That can be a form of trauma to them. So that type of trauma can present in a lot of different ways, whether that's anger or sadness or, all sorts of things. So kind of crisis intervention services, de-escalation services, any sort of abuse concerns. So in the state of California, as of currently, just because there aren't that many veterinary social workers, we are not technically mandated reporters for animal abuse. The veterinarians and the registered technicians are. That being said, our abuse reporting system is very, very flawed, and is very time consuming, often taking hours to actually just report abuse or consult with someone if it is, difficult to determine if it is reportable. So myself and my staff have kind of taken over that to alleviate the doctors from having to wait on hold for 2 hours sometimes. But I am a mandated reporter for child abuse, elder or dependent adult abuse. So sometimes that does happen. I'm not a mandated reporter for intimate partner violence, domestic violence, but there is a large intersection between animal abuse and domestic violence. So assessing for those things, although I'm not reporting them and providing services to that population, is definitely something that I do. Any sort of death and dying things, resource allocation, financial assistance, resources, kind of education about resources within the community. There's more, but I could go on for a really long time. I'm quite busy, and that's the client sector. The staff sector is somewhat similar, and there is a crossover between the two. If I wasn't there, or days that for whatever reason I'm not there, that emotional burden does lie on the staff of the hospital to work through this trauma with the clients. The veterinary field has almost zero education on like interpersonal communication. And staff are confronted with a lot of people problems that they don't know how to navigate. So acting as a liaison, and that works for the clients and for the staff. If they're not able to communicate effectively or efficiently, I can be a liaison. I can help debrief on those very difficult cases. A big one that comes up that can be very triggering for the staff is if a client does not believe in humane euthanasia and they are having to watch this patient suffer and die without or with minimal support, talking through those cases, the clients that they've worked with for a long time or the patients they've worked with for a long time, if they were to pass away, talking through those things, just general crisis intervention as well. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of staff at the current hospital at our work go through deaths of all sorts, sickness of family members, just traumas. Unfortunately, there's been a large amount of rapes and sexual assaults in the community that I work with, just a lot of trauma in the community. So again, that crisis intervention being a safe, comfortable person that they could talk to about these things, a confidential space they can talk to, and a place for resource as well. So I often will find my staff therapists that they can follow up with long-term. Mediation, conflict mediation can be a big part of what I do. Again, there's a lot of stuff.
There's so many things. I don't
want to take up a huge chunk of your time, but that's kind of a large overview of the things that I do in the staff and client sector.
So what do you think are like maybe the 2 to 3 main things that make the veterinary field especially hard to work in?
Oh my God, there's so many. It's such a multifactorial problem. And it's something that I know several universities are researching, is just the vulnerabilities within this field and how they relate to the high rates of suicidality. And it's something you mentioned as well. I anecdotally have picked up on this. People coming into this field come into this field already with trauma and vulnerability. I think often people who are attracted to animal medicine versus human medicine are people who have been wronged by humans, right? But they're comforted by animals, right? Humans have wronged them. Animals have just provided them with that unconditional love that they're so good at providing. And then they were confronted with, again, those people problems that I was talking about, angry, traumatized, scared people who have control because animals are technically property over the medical care that is provided to our patients. Also, they are not educated on psychology necessarily or communication tactics. So there's a lot of conflict that comes there. I also think that they're exposed to trauma every single day, especially for technicians and staff who work in emergency. We have cases where animals are horrifically abused. We have cases where animals are shot. We have cases where they're hit by cars, attacked by other animals, just really overt traumas. They are often desensitized to death to a certain degree because of humane euthanasia as an option, which is a wonderful thing in my opinion, but can be very psychologically difficult to process when you're doing it day in and day out. Often, not in my hospital, but before I got there, there is no resources for them. Mental health care is expensive. It's not covered. Often they're making very little money. They're working 7 days a week just to make ends meet and doing the job of 20 people. There are just so many factors that make this particular field very vulnerable.
Yeah, and I know I've also heard this, that especially emergency-wise, that veterinary technicians, the staff, the doctors, actually see death more than a hospice nurse does.
I believe that.
Which is just, it's a hard field, I'll tell you guys.
Yeah, I don't think anyone who hasn't worked in vet med, myself included, before I worked in the field, has any concept of really what the day-to-day looks like for a veterinary technician or a veterinarian, especially working in a hospital, but even in the GP. On the busiest day that I had, I probably had 8 or 9 euthanasias in a 10-hour shift. And that is just part of what I do. There were other things that came in, right? That's only part of what the doctor does. That's only part of what the technician does. To just see death after death after death after death, or people leaving the hospital with treatable conditions, but they can't afford to treat it, it just feels very helpless, or it can feel very helpless.
Well, thank you for that. I think this is an excellent place to transition to June 16, 2021. This was the day that I was planning on taking my life, but through miracles of my personal therapist and Rebecca, my life was saved that day. I was placed on a 5150 hold, and more formally known as a suicide hold. From this hold, my eating disorder was finally figured out as well. And I honestly can say that there's not much of that day that I can 100% remember. I know that I got to work early. I did all my morning routine stuff before the others got there. Then at 9 a.m. I went to my car to have my weekly therapy session. And next thing I remember is being in your car, Rebecca, and you asking if I was okay. I know that you also, it's been a little bit, obviously, since 2021. Can you remember a little bit more about that day?
I can, yes. Yeah. So I think I was actually in a euthanasia. I was finishing up with euthanasia and I got a text from you. I think it was somewhat vague. I think it was just like, can you come to my car? I need to talk to you about something. So I finished up with euthanasia. I met you in your car in the parking lot, and your therapist I don't remember if she was on FaceTime or if it was a call.
FaceTime. It was FaceTime, I think.
Yeah. She let me know that you guys had been talking in that session, and you and her were both concerned for your life, and your level of suicidality at that moment, and you were open to a voluntary hold, and that you needed to go to the hospital. This is, again, to go back to insurance being so lovely and wonderful. And ambulance is often the safest option to get someone to a hospital. What most people don't know is that ambulances are not ever covered by insurance and can be sometimes thousands of dollars. With the fact that it was a voluntary hold and not an involuntary hold necessarily, I wasn't as concerned with driving you there myself. So I wanted to offer that just to have it be as safe and comfortable as possible. Going in an ambulance can be kind of traumatic. You're with people you don't know. You don't necessarily know which hospital you're going to be going to. So we drove to Huntington, right?
Yep.
We drove to Huntington in Pasadena. I kind of talked through what those next steps would be when you get there. I helped you check in, and then I stayed with you in the emergency room until there was a safe and comfortable time for me to leave for you.
Yeah. So Rebecca not only stayed with me in the hospital for over 6 hours, but not only was she being a coworker that day, but she was also being a friend in my support system that day. And she made sure that I was going to be taken care of and get the help that I so desperately needed. Can you kind of explain the process of what happens when you bring somebody to the hospital and what they go through? Like, how do you continue being professional, but also you're supporting a friend in a crisis situation?
Yeah, so I think can be and should be a lot of crossover between a good clinician, a good mental health clinician, and a friend, but with boundaries is the biggest thing that kind of separates those. As a social worker, I went into this field because I wanted to be an advocate and I wanted to be support to people that didn't necessarily have that. So that was my goal for you. I didn't want you to feel even more afraid than I'm sure you were already feeling in that moment. And I happened to work at a human hospital, so I was quite familiar with what to expect with that process. And I wanted to make that process known to you and to be by your side throughout that. So basically, we checked in together. You were minimally verbal at that time. I think you were just very in your own thoughts, in shock. Also, I think you and I both knew to a certain extent that this was a long time coming. I'm sure you can speak to it more than I can, but I'm sure it felt quite surreal. So I was kind of acting as your advocate and a little bit of your voice at the time to help you get through that process. So I helped you check in. You get kind of medically assessed, and then you're brought to a room in the emergency department where there often is a very long wait, which is the nature of emergency medicine in human and in animal medicine. And then a psychiatrist comes, or someone from the PET team, the psychiatric evaluation team, comes to determine if you are holdable, quote unquote holdable, to be placed on a 5150 hold. They ask you questions about kind of your history, what you're experiencing right now, safety concerns, and then they work with some type of discharge manager or case manager to find the next step of hospitalization in a psychiatric setting.
Which is one thing I had to move from Huntington because my insurance did not cover their behavioral health. I did have to move to another behavioral health center from Huntington and actually did have to take the ambulance. So I know that I had all the signs and I chose to ignore them. Can you talk about the signs and symptoms of suicide ideation and kind of the warning signs?
A big thing is hopelessness. So a feeling like things cannot get better. Once you reach that point of hopelessness, it is a pretty dangerous territory to be in. Often that hopelessness comes with little support, isolation. If I can, I will say what I saw in you was
go ahead. Yes.
Kind of the worst case of compassion fatigue I've ever seen. You were severely depressed. You, if I can say, had a very difficult time saying no or setting boundaries. And you put others' wellness on your shoulders, and you carry others' wellness in your heart so deeply. And that is a big weight to bear. And I think not having the appropriate outlets or feeling like you deserved that support really are what I observed led you to that point of hopelessness and suicidality, in conjunction with several other things that I'm sure you will touch on.
Yes. When do you typically get involved? Like, if I know obviously my case was my therapist asked you to come in, but in other cases, at what point do you say, I think we need to take, you to the hospital, or,
in regards to suicidality specifically, when do I get involved?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this kind of goes back to some of the laws and ethics of being an LCSW. So we hold confidentiality, but there are some outliers to that confidentiality. So thank you for firstly specifying in the beginning that I have your consent to talk about these things.
Yes.
Normally, I would never talk about these things with anyone, because this is confidential information between client, patient, and clinician. The outliers to those confidentiality are if someone is a danger to themselves or others, or there is child abuse, dependent adult, or elder abuse going on. So danger to others is a specific law called terrorism. If someone wants to harm or kill an identified other, we by law have to inform that identified other and the police. Danger to self, we have to inform, if you're not someone who is able to place a 5150 hold, you have to inform or get them to a person who can place that 5150 hold. So that, I'm sorry, I don't even remember what question you asked. I went on a little bit of a tangent.
Just like when you
So ideally, how I like to work in my hospital specifically is having some level of relationship with every staff member of that hospital. So there is already a level of comfortability and rapport I have with those people rather. So my other cases that I've had to take people to a hospital, because Carra was not, well, she was the first, but she was not the last of the times I've driven people to the hospital for suicide ideation. A large majority of the time, it's a similar experience because I do have those relationships already built to a certain degree, where often someone will come to me expressing that they are concerned for themselves. Often this is someone who has had some level of concern that we've talked through for a prolonged period of time, or sometimes a short period of time. There are times in which other people will inform me that they are concerned for their employee or their coworker. One of the foundations of the ethics of social work is like meeting people where they're at. So we can't force people to come talk to me. I can introduce myself to them. I can, again, continue to build that rapport. But when that crosses over of I have to, by law, insert myself is when there's a danger to self or others.
Got it. So how do we kind of combat taking action in people's lives versus not stepping over their boundaries? Like, when somebody's hurting, but at what point do you say, nope, this person needs help. I don't care. I'm stepping over the boundaries,
I think we have to specify the we. Like my mandates are different than a friend's mandates, right? If I'm working in my capacity as a veterinary social worker, as an LCSW, I have strict boundaries of kind of what I was talking about. I cannot, and I should not force someone to treatment without them being willing to do so, specifically in my role, unless they are a danger to themselves or others. I would honestly recommend friends to do the same, but every case is a little bit different. I firmly believe in meeting people where they're at. If they are not ready for that treatment, we can provide our recommendation. We can provide them with what our concerns are. We can share that they're loved and this is coming from a place of love and I want to support you. Often that treatment is not going to be successful if that person does not want to be there. I was very glad that yours was a voluntary hold. Often 5150s are involuntary holds. Someone does not have say to be in that hospital if they are a danger to themselves. But I think that's a really, really, it's a tricky question, right? Because if you see someone struggling,
it is. Yep.
If you see someone struggling, you want to help so badly. My belief is not that that won't be successful if they don't want that help themselves, but I think the likelihood of that help being successful or leading to meaningful change is less if they don't accept that help.
With the heavy load that you take on, what steps do you follow to take care of yourself after trying to take care of everybody else? Like, how do you decompress?
Yeah, people ask me this a lot. And I think I'm just wired, frankly, where I can shut things off very easily. I'm very good at compartmentalizing. When I am at work, when I am in social work mode, I'm in 100%. When I get in my car and leave work, I always tell my staff as I'm leaving, like, I love you all, goodbye. And then jokingly, it's like, but then you're dead to me. Like, I am stepping out of this physical being of being a clinician, and I'm stepping into being Rebecca, the person. I think I'm just a little bit naturally geared that way. So I feel lucky, and that's part of what drew me to this field. I think that's just kind of in my nature. A habit I picked up kind of unintentionally, but it was when I was working at the human hospital. When I would get home, the first thing I would do is shower. And I kind of visualized myself like showering the day away, physically and emotionally, because I was full of disgusting germs, but also just to that was kind of a reset for me. And that has stayed habit basically throughout my time as a clinician. I get in the car, and that is a physical transition from work to home and an emotional transition from work to home. And then I shower the day away, and then I go from Rebecca the social worker to Rebecca the regular human, just me.
So I know a lot of people ask this or ask these kind of questions too. Do social workers, do therapists have therapists?
Oh, good ones do. Yeah. I think just because someone is a social worker, just because someone is a therapist, doesn't mean they're good. I have unfortunately come across a lot of bad clinicians. And I think a lot of those bad clinicians don't have therapists. I think it is only fair to know what it's like to sit on the other side of that and be in that vulnerable position. I think it's also extremely important, again, because of confidentiality. We can't necessarily talk and vent about our jobs to people in the way that most people can, because it's illegal. So being in that's part of what supervision is, clinical supervision is. I don't have clinical supervision anymore since I am in LCSW, so I do have a therapist. I'm very grateful to that therapist. I'm at a point where I don't need to see them weekly, but I do have them. But if I could go back a little bit, not all therapists are good therapists. And so I take students, I take MSW interns as well. And that's something, and for my staff, that I really hammer home is you as a clinician are in a position of power, and you have the ability to save someone's life, and you also have the ability to ruin someone's life. There have been many, many clients and staff that I have worked with who have worked with bad clinicians, and it has turned them off from therapy completely and completely shut them down from being emotionally vulnerable. We have the power to do that. I never want to be the reason that someone never goes to a therapist again.
So as we kind of start wrapping up, I'd like to ask you if there's anything else you'd like the listeners to know.
If the listeners are not in the veterinary field, I would like them to just understand these vulnerabilities of the people that, especially with COVID, you're not going into the hospital, you're having basically only phone or very minimal in-person interactions with these staff. These staff do the job of probably 10, at least the veterinary technicians do the job of what 10 people do at a human hospital and get paid probably less than half. We are chronically understaffed. We they experience trauma every single day, and they love your pets. They would not be in this field that is so difficult and pay so little if they didn't love animals. They are never in it for the money. So please, we understand that you are in a time of crisis. We empathize with that because we've been there ourselves, but please extend some patience and courtesy to the veterinary field, to the technicians and the doctors. For those who work in the veterinary field, know you're not alone. If you work in a hospital that does not have a social worker, please advocate to get one for your hospital. I know it can be a difficult thing to advocate for because we are not traditionally money-making positions. We cost money and they don't see the same return as they would with a technician or a doctor. But I think we provide return in a lot of different ways. So obviously I have a bias because I'm a veterinary social worker, but I really do think it makes a difference. And if you have questions about it, there are many resources online. I would be happy to be a resource to anyone who has questions about veterinary social work and what that integration looks like. There are many other people available I can refer you to who also do.
Yeah, we can make sure to include those in the show notes at the end. So, Rebecca, thank you so incredibly much for being on this episode with me today. I know I've said this a million times. Yes, I know I've said this a million times to you, but I will never stop because I cannot thank you enough from the bottom of my heart for helping to save my life that day and give me the opportunity to finally get the help I so desperately needed. I'm a firm believer that people come into our lives for a reason, and I wholeheartedly believe that you came into mine to save me. So I just want to say thank you because my life has completely changed because of this experience, and it's an amazing thing, and I'm just so happy for you to have been in my life. So
I am so happy to be in your life and to have been in your life at that time. I'm very grateful to you. You have changed my life. You are the one who got me into this field. You are the one who supported me in the transition in the hospital, and I so know that you also had an equal significance in impacting my life for the better. So thank you.
The Journey podcast is brought to you by Dr. April's Hollywood Mobile Vet, Craft 9 Hair Design, and a list of community backers, which you will see in the show notes. This podcast is produced and edited by Mahia TV and can be found on all major podcast platforms. You can support this podcast by liking this episode and subscribing to it. You can also support me by rating this podcast and following me on social media at The Journey Podcast CY. Also, join me every week for a hike around the Los Angeles area. For more information on this episode, visit www.thejourneypodcastcy.com. Thank you for listening and supporting The Journey Podcast.